My last video looked at the idea of the brain as being a sort of information processor. Now, I wasn't saying it's nothing but an information processor, so whether there's a question of being a soul or a spirit or something like that didn't come into it. I was just looking at the simple fact that it seems to take in information and use it to create what I call a sensory user interface, which gives us this solid world that we call reality. So this time I thought I'd see if you could apply sort of similar thinking to a population or a crowd as an information processor. What happens when you put in a rumour or an idea into a crowd? Can we predict the outcome? To get the idea started, I'm going to begin with a ridiculously simple model, unrealistic and simple. Imagine you've got 10,000 soldiers standing on parade to attention on a parade ground, 100 by 100. They're all equally spaced, which means you put out your left arm and you touch the right shoulder of the person there. Put out your right arm, you touch the left shoulder of the person there. Reach forward your arm and you touch the shoulder of the person in front of you, and so on all the way through, all equally spaced. And you give those soldiers a set of what you might call switching instructions. They'll be receiving messages in a tap from this direction and passing on in that direction. And the instructions might be something like this. If you receive a tap on this shoulder and a tap from behind, then what you do is you reach forward and you tap the shoulder of the person in front of you. If you only receive a tap on the right shoulder and nothing from behind, instead you reach out your left arm and touch the right shoulder of the person to your left. If you only receive a tap from behind, then you ignore it. Now, in doing that, what you've done is you've set up that group of soldiers as a sort of switch array that will pass messages from one to the other according to a certain pattern. And so a very clever machine coder could, in theory, go along the back row, tapping shoulders in a certain way all the way along, and basically be programming this thing with a calculation, which would then ripple through the whole structure and come out the other end. The calculation would have been solved because it's acting like a very simple computer. The people are like transistors. Now, that is terribly unrealistic because, first of all, you wouldn't get 10,000 soldiers standing in array and being that obedient and that precise. The other thing is, of course, the people in a crowd are humans. They're individuals. And for a start, that adds the question of resistance instead of a knee-jerk response. If a message comes to me, I might not like the message. I might think it's offensive. And I erase it and refuse to pass it on. Or else it might simply be rather boring and irrelevant, and I don't pass it on. Or else I might find it rather exciting and want to pass it on in many different ways. Tell my friends in the street, retweet it, put it on my Facebook page. So the same message could go to thousands of people. And what's more, even if I'm enthusiastically wanting to pass on that message, other things can happen, like my cell phone was off or run out of power, so I didn't get the message. Or I can't send it on for some reason because I'm driving. So instead of that nice simple array of soldiers, what we got is a very complex system. And a complex system can't be predicted in the same way. That raises the question, can we say anything about what happens when a message passes through a crowd? I'm going to explore this with assuming a very bland message being sent by a big influencer, someone who's got millions of followers. So let's imagine Elon Musk, who has got millions of followers and is a strong influencer. Imagine one morning he tweets, "All the world needs is more love and less anger." Now that's a pretty bland message. So can I say what would happen? Well, wouldn't it be lovely if that launched a worldwide movement of love and good nature? But I think it's very unlikely. I wouldn't predict that. Can I say anything? Well, a message like that is more likely to be transmitted by a New Ager than by a neo-Nazi. That's not saying very much. So I can't make any prediction at all. Well, yes, I predict that that message would make a headline. Simply, although it's a boring message, simply because anything that Elon Musk says seems to make a headline. So somewhere it would be reported that he'd said that. But that's not very much, is it? But let's add another line of code to this message. Instead of him tweeting, "All the world needs is more love and less hatred, anger," he's going to tweet, "Donald Trump seems to think that all the world needs is more love and less anger." Now, I still can't say what the outcome of that would be, but I think I could say it would be more headlines, because the word Donald Trump adds extra fuel to the flame. And if I added another line of code, and we had Elon Musk tweeting, "At breakfast today with Hillary Clinton, she told me that she thinks that that Donald Trump believes that all the world needs is more love and less anger." Now, I think that would make a lot of headlines, if only because there's Elon Musk having breakfast with Hillary Clinton. But what the outcome, what really happens with all that, apart from a bit of a stink and a flap and a frenzy, I do not know. So does it mean that we can do nothing about predicting what happens when messages pass through crowds or populations or society? Well, there are companies which specialize in trying to predict the outcome. And they boast that they can predict the outcome. Now, I don't trust their boast, because we're dealing with a complex system. They can't really, but they can make some sort of broad drift based on the things they input. Rather like what I talked about they set up a prevailing wind. And firms like Cambridge Analytica in England famously stole a lot of Facebook information in order to try to influence the population. And people like that would claim that they can at least create what I called a sort of prevailing wind blowing in a certain direction. And people like that were used by, for instance, during the Brexit campaign and the elections where Donald Trump was elected. And we're told that the Russians use this in quite a big way to try to influence Western decision-making and Western values, and to confuse the population. And I wonder how that works. And then I realised that in a sense I was in on that game in the 80s when I was a copywriter, working as a copywriter. You see, as a copywriter, I'm asked to help provide the words for a brochure. And typically it would be to sell some rather sort of complicated information technology to businessmen. And I have to come up with words that will make them more likely to phone up and find out more. The sort of thing I would do is I'd write out the explanation of what it was all about, and I'd end with a sentence like, "This all might seem very complicated, but the outcome is much simpler. It can actually be summed up in a single word: success." Now that's rather good, isn't it? Yes, busy businessman doesn't want to read all that stuff, but he's told, the result is success. So I decide I'm going to make that last word, success, into a single word sentence. It can be summed up in one word, full stop. Success, full stop. And I look at it and I look at the layout of the page and I think, no, I'm going to take that one word and make it a one-word paragraph. So the outcome can be summed up in a single word. Success. Now, why do I do that? It's a bit like poetry. You're sort of not only thinking of the words, but where you place them on the page. And what I'm doing is really what I call basic magical thinking. I'm imagining my audience, the busy businessman, and I'm sort of invoking the spirit of that audience and putting my mind in their shoes. And I say this is like my idea of basic magical thinking, the baby who, having discovered all the predictable things like spoons falling to the floor and things like that, realizes mother is more complex and begins to be able to understand mother when he thinks, what if there's a mind outside my own head? And what if my mother has a mind? I say this is pre-verbal, but basically that's the idea. Imagining a mind inside mother, you can begin to understand the things that she does. And that's really what I'm doing, this basic magical thinking, to the population of businessmen. I'm thinking they're very busy. I've got to tell them some of the facts. So I write this kind of complicated stuff. And I imagine their eyes glancing over it and say, I can't be bothered with this stuff, and putting it aside. But some of them will say, oh God, what's all this about? I'm going to look at the last sentence. Oh, success. Summed up in words there. Oh, that's rather interesting. I think I might look at some of the earlier bits. And so I'm sort of making the wind blow towards busy business and reading a bit more of my brochure. Now, this is obviously not an exact science, but you can see how this works on some of the macro examples. And I mentioned a couple of videos back when I was talking about the paradox of populism. Our own South African Populist Party. Now I explained that we're divided, the ANC, the government, is divided into two almost equal parts, what I call BRICS versus Britain, because Ramaphosa represents BRICS. By that I mean the sort of union, like you've got the European Union, but the union between Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa. And so he came out with some statements which were sounded a bit pro-Putin, which shocked people, but he was speaking in terms of BRICS as a cooperating member of BRICS. Now the other, which I call the British side, the RET faction, they're not literally British. The thing is, there's a movement that was imported from Britain. When they were trying to get more influence, they paid a British company, Bell Pottinger, to come up with a movement, to invent a movement and instruct it. And Bell Pottinger thought, how are we going to ignite and get support, get people worked up about this movement? And they realized that you've got to get through the skin of resistance. You see, Nelson Mandela had spread the idea of the rainbow nation, that we are South Africans, we're all united. And what you've got to do is get through that skin. And the way a microbe does it, you see, a microbe would have difficulty getting through my skin because it's designed to keep microbes out. But if there's an open wound, that's where the microbes would go in. That's the easy entry. And so Bell Pottinger looked, where is there an open wound in South Africa? And it was, of course, the fact that 30 years ago, there were several decades of the apartheid regime. So they realized if they could come up with phrases which revived the spirit of the apartheid regime, that would penetrate through the skin. And so that's what they did. They came up with phrases like white monopoly capital, things like that, WMC. And they then instructed the people to behave more like those soldiers. Any message which has got WMC in it, pass it on to as many people as possible. Act like those soldiers. And they actually created those soldiers on the internet, what's called bots. They set up networks where any message was on the Twitter sphere with WMC in it would be forwarded to as many people as possible. And so they created this sort of drift of these words, these phrases, this propaganda for the RET faction, sweeping through the internet. And you see, although it was, most of the people were not robots, if you think about it, if the robots make a certain phrase become very prevalent, it feels like a fashion, a craze. It feels trending. And so people, if they're in a great hurry, are more likely in a knee-jerk way to pass on that same message. And so this message floods through the internet and through society, because people say, do you know what I read yesterday, blah, 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 and or this morning. And so the Bell Pottinger set up this very powerful split in the ANC with this RET faction. And you see, what is interesting is I started with this unrealistic idea of soldiers acting like robots. And you can see that would be ideal for people like Bell Pottinger because you could be sure what the outcome was going to be. But what they did is added robots to the system in order to build up that sort of wind to a gale force as it sweeps through. Now, witnessing that sort of manipulation of society is upsetting, and the question is, what can one do about it? Well, one thing is an analysis like this. If you can see what's happening, it helps you to maybe work towards some sort of solution. But I'm more interested, as a magical thinker, on the individual. What do you do as an individual when you find society is sweeping along in a certain direction, which you may not agree with entirely? And the first thing is you can get on your high horse and say, I'm an individual, I'm a Thelemite, I do what I will, I'm not affected by the masses. But I'd warn against that because, as I've pointed out in other videos, we are naturally individuals, we're also herd animals. It's not just that it's rather nice to be part of a herd. To some extent, we actually need it. It's so exhilarating to be in a great crowd supporting a certain team, all together singing the same thing at the same time and everything. Many people, it's uplifting, energizing. So just to say, oh, I'm not having anything to do with that, isn't quite enough, because you have to work with the fact that it's nice to be part of a movement. It's fun to be in a crowd. So what do you do when you hear a message? Well, as I say, if you don't like the message, you can just raise it. If it's boring, you can ignore it. But if it's a message that sort of excites you, either for or against, anger or joy, you want to pass it on. And all I could say is that if you take a step back and consider your true will, what you really want to happen, it might help you to make a better decision. And the other thing is to apply that magical thinking. Put yourself in the position of society as a whole. Feed that message in and say, is this going to help make things better? Or might it just cause polarization? It's just a way of, if your magicians use magical thinking, to see if it can inform how you behave, to stop you being an absolute automatic robot, passing on messages that have been designed by other people to cause a certain effect, which may not be an effect that you would want to cause.